Hi everyone, so this is part 2 of the videos where I talk about the carbon tax in Singapore. I kind of had to cut short the entire video because it ended up being too long, so if you want to see part 1, it's somewhere in the links, you can just click around and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Anyway, in this video, I go on to raise 2 potential objections that people who don't like the carbon tax might raise against the carbon tax, and I explain what I think about them and why I don't think they're that valid as reasons to not have a carbon tax. I then go on to address the people who actually like the carbon tax and the people who think that it doesn't go far enough, and I present my thoughts on these as sort of my conclusion to my entire thoughts on the carbon tax. So without further ado, here is the spiel that I recorded from a while back. So I think there are 3 immediate concerns that people are going to be raising in response to this argument about the carbon tax. The first is about inequality. What happens when only the rich people can afford to pay for these higher costs and the poor people are a lot less well off because everything is more expensive? If we take into account the magnitude of the entire climate change problem, poor people all across the world are going to be impacted even more heavily if we let this climate change problem escalate. So now this raises the question, do I care more about the poor in my country or do I care more about the poor in other countries? Let's face the reality that living in Singapore is quite a bit better than living in other places. Once you look at the problem of climate change as a whole, it kind of becomes obvious that the poor in other countries are going to be hit harder than the poor in Singapore. They're going to be hit by hurricanes, flash floods, rising sea levels, falling agricultural yield, all of these sorts of problems that we don't quite yet have to grapple with within Singapore. So dealing with the international problem first helps poor people on a larger scale than just focusing on those in Singapore. But why should we care about the international poor first when we should be thinking about Singaporeans' well-being? Now I want to encourage you to think about this sort of selfish behavior from perspectives of other countries. The US and China could just be like, well, we don't care about Singapore, we're not Singapore, let's keep polluting and then we'll let the island go underwater, and if it does because of rising sea levels, then too bad. So selfish behavior doesn't really help anybody in the international community, and it especially doesn't help small or poor countries that are disadvantaged and don't really have a lot of say on the international stage. Singapore is one of them, so thinking selfishly doesn't really have a place in the climate change conversation. So the last argument that I foresee people putting up is that Singapore is so small and it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, if we reduce our carbon emissions, it doesn't do anything to the global carbon budget. Well, this is true, but there are also a lot of other small countries out there who contribute less than 1% of the global carbon emissions. But if you add everyone together, they kind of form a big chunk, and if every single country says, nope, not going to do any carbon reduction, you kind of get a huge amount of percentage of global carbon emissions that's not being reduced or being dealt with in any way. So every single small country has a part, even though it's small. So that's my spiel to the people who hate the carbon tax because it's giving more money to the government. That's not really the point, and at the end of the day, we all have to pay for our stay here on Earth. So now to the people who love the tax, I argue that it's a good start, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. Firstly, the price isn't high enough. So if we look back at last year when the government first started proposing the tax, they were thinking about $10 to $20, but since then they've dropped off to the $5 is going to be implemented. And this is a really low number compared to other countries in the region. So doing a quick Google search, Guangdong has a $3 cost per ton of carbon, Shanghai has 5.5, South Korea at 8, Beijing at 10, Europe at 12, and the Swiss top up at about 135. Now the Swiss are comparable to Singapore, but in this case I don't think going to $135 is advisable for a carbon tax anyway. At the end of the day, the correct price is somewhere in the middle of those numbers, and I'd argue it's a bit higher than the 5 that we have right now. 10 to 15 might be good in the future, but at that point in time, we're also going to need more steep carbon reduction as time goes by. So we might need to raise it some more above $10 to $15 in order to see results that we need to be getting by that point in time. The other issue I have with the carbon tax is that it doesn't cover small scale emissions that is being done on a regular basis. So for example, the fuel from your cars isn't actually being taxed right now. Yes, you've got the import tax from bringing fuel into the country, but the carbon emissions aren't being calculated into that tax. Other sources of carbon emissions that aren't being counted include planes and ships that bring in stuff to the country and bring people out of the country. All of this stuff isn't being taxed under the carbon tax, and it's the things that we need to start thinking about, which are also emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So lastly, to the people who hate the tax because they don't think it goes far enough and doesn't do enough to reduce carbon or incentivize the reduction of carbon in the long run, I think I mostly agree with you. So Singapore pulled back on its initial proposal of $10 to $20 per ton of carbon, and I think this was an opportunity missed in that aspect. However, if you think about the way that the Singapore government operates, this kind of fits in with its modus operandi. It kind of does very small, very gradual implementation of certain policies with very, very slow steps that increase over time. The government is also concerned about not scaring away businesses that might impact our economic performance. And so this kind of makes sense if you think about it in that way. Yes, the cost is too low, but this is characteristic of the way that the Singapore government behaves, and mostly it has worked well in the past. At the end of the day, this tax represents progress, and our government is really good at managing schemes and making plans and proposals for the future, and I trust that they will continue to do this with the carbon tax. After all, with the carbon tax now implemented, I think that things can pretty much only go up from here, and I hope that I'm not wrong. The Singapore government really listens to its people, and so it's up to us to change the perception of the carbon tax. Go out and speak to your friends, your family members, your schoolmates, whoever it is, about why this tax is important, why it's important that we reduce our carbon emissions. And if we are able to change enough of the public sentiment, you might be able to see changes in parliament and government. I mean, one of the things that you could do is start a YouTube channel and talk about issues like this with your friends. Just a thought. At the end of the day, I like the carbon tax. I think it's moving in the right direction. I think it's part of the global sentiment that's moving us towards a carbon-free future. So that's all for this video. I have class in 2 minutes, which I think I'm probably going to be late for. If you like this video, share it with your friends. We need more people talking about the carbon tax. If you want to see more, subscribe. I'm hopefully going to be putting out more videos in the future, in the upcoming weeks. Fingers crossed my semester doesn't get crazy like last year. Yeah, and hang around. Thanks for listening. See you guys.